This morning, we have an interesting group of individuals on the stage who are all doing work in education reform. And so this panel this morning will be devoted to talking about ed reform and the things that we're doing. We're in an interesting place in Mississippi as regards to education policy, as regards to providing a high quality education, not to just some of our students in our state, but to all students in our state. So this morning, we're going to begin that critical conversation about one, what are we doing? Two, how you can get involved, and three, what does the future look like for scholars all across Mississippi? And so I'll start by introducing our panelists this morning. We have Eric Bennett, who's also on our staff. Eric Bennett has devoted, he finished a robust thesis around ed reform and school choice. He did his research there, and he's going to law school at the University of Alabama this fall. So we're excited about that for him. We have Representative Jay Hughes. Representative Jay Hughes represents Oxford in the state legislature, and we all know him as a champion of education. In this past legislative session, he's kept us very up to date and aware of what's going on in our state legislature about ed reform, and so you'll see him be very passionate about these things on the stage. So let's give him a round of applause. Beside me, we have Ms. Crystal Cormack. She has been a classroom teacher. She's led in schools. She works for Teach for America, and she also serves on the statewide charter school authorizer board, leading our mission of bringing more schools to kids across the state of Mississippi. So let's give her a round of applause. And y'all know me, so we'll just jump in and get started this morning. What did you say? All right. So we're going to jump in this morning. I'm going to ask the panelists to kind of share what is your story, how you got involved in public education, and what kind of drives you to fight for education every day. So I'll rotate this mic around and allow these folks to share with you what they do, their story, and how they got involved.
Good morning, gentlemen. I went to the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign and was a broadcast journalism major. And never thought about becoming a teacher, never thought that education was going to be a field that I would be interested in. And then around my junior or senior year, I started to hear more about this program called Teach for America, decided to do some research on it, applied and got in, and I was thinking that I would get placed in Chicago because that was my hometown, and I kind of wanted to go home, and I got placed in Mississippi. And so I came to Mississippi to teach 4th grade in Jonestown, Mississippi, which is in the North Delta, and fell in love with teaching, fell in love with my students, and began to immediately recognize some of the issues that my students were facing with regard to poverty, with regard to access to quality, and with regard to rural teacher shortages and how students in some communities don't have access to teachers at all. And so I've been now involved in education for going on quite a few years, a little bit more than a decade. My husband is an educator as well, and I just continue to fight and try to be a voice for my students and for students across the state who need access to great teaching and who want the doors of college to be open for them. And so that's sort of how I became involved in teaching and education and what kind of keeps me going 10 years or so later.
I think I've got this right. Let me put this one, get that there so you can see. Very good. As Mr. Cortez said, my name is Jay Hughes, and I'm a state legislator. I'm going to deviate from the script like we like to do sometimes for one thing, because to me, one thing that Boys State can benefit from is the recognizing the beauty of civility. And that is that while Eric and Crystal and Cortez and I all may have very different views about how to get there, what we all want is what's best for Mississippi. And I feel that that's true as well in the legislature. and the Senate and the Capitol, that just because somebody disagrees with you doesn't make them a bad person. In fact, what y'all are all doing here is learning to be leaders. One thing that I feel that's been so lost over the last few years in cable and radio is the lack of ability to be civil. Crystal and Eric and I have had many exchanges online and on the phone. And we have different goals of how to reach. We have different routes of how to reach the same goal, but we've always been civil and respectful. So just keep that in mind, please, as you move on and become leaders in your community, that it's okay to be different and have different views, and it doesn't make them a bad person. It doesn't make Eric right or me wrong or Crystal wrong or me right, but maintain that civility and respect, and it's amazing how many great ideas might come from that. So, that being said, my background in education, it started in kindergarten when I was suspended. I was always a rambunctious kid and never really as focused as I should have been in school. My path toward being passionate about education started much later, after I got out of the Army. And I spoke to y'all on Memorial Day and said that I went. It was kind of a unique path. But what it was is, I come from a family that was poor and had no one that had been to college before or anything like that. My parents were adamant that I would not repeat that I would, with my siblings, go to school. I ended up getting out of the Army, going to college, and being able to break free of the chains that had held us back in poverty for so long. And when I got to Oxford to go to law school, which was an amazing feat for our family, I got involved in the Rotary Club and got involved with the local high school on leadership, much like y'all are doing. And it was there that I realized for the first time how a person can make a difference in a child's life by giving them hope and faith and access that there is something better out there. So from the time I got here in '88, my wife and I have been very involved and passionate about public education. It was the key that got me out of poverty, and it's the path for so many people. We've been involved from parent organizations to volunteering to making donations, etc. I'm very proud of my wife, who's been Parent of the Year many times, and I have as well. The key to education is the quality teachers, quality parents, and good old-fashioned give a damn. And we need more of it, and we need to figure out how to install it. So I'm passionate about it, and that's why I went to the legislature, to fight for it. So I don't always agree with everyone or everyone on this stage, but we all do what's best, and that's Mississippi getting out of 50th place in education. Thank you.
Similar to Representative Hughes, I came from a very low-income family in a fairly underperforming school in Mississippi. So I kind of got started, especially really caring about education and education reform in middle school when the state took over the school that I was attending. And my family was trying to find any way possible to get me out of that school, yet we couldn't afford to actually move, things like that, or go to private school, anything like that. And eventually, my local senator figured out a way where he had his sister and her husband agreed to adopt me and become my legal guardians so I could transfer into the top 5 district in the state that was 100 yards down the road from where I originally lived. And so ever since then, throughout high school, I made the most of that opportunity and am still trying to make the most of that opportunity. So for me, the biggest thing was helping other kids get those opportunities that aren't lucky enough to randomly meet their local senator and help get those kind of blessings. And so with education reform, the biggest thing is every one of those underperforming schools that so many people just want to give up on and just assume that they're going to continue the endless cycle of poverty and lack of education. Every single one of those schools has those kids that all they need is a chance. All they need is one person to take interest in them and give them that hope and give them reason to believe in themselves, and they will make the most of it. And so as Cortez said, I just finished my senior thesis on education reform in Mississippi and promoting school choice as a way to give kids in those schools a way out, a way to make the most of their own opportunities and have people that believe in them. And so even though, as Representative Hughes said, we disagree on some things, we all want to see these kids that are constantly beaten down in the media, just being stuck in that cycle, and many people want to blame their parents for those circumstances. Instead of casting blame on each other because of our different views, we all have to work towards that view, and that's what I'm trying to do.
So I do want to shift the conversation. I'm glad you took us to the place that you took us to, Eric, in that how do we get to a place where kids in Mississippi every kid does not have access to finding a local senator who can say, I want to adopt you so that you can attend a high-performing school district in the state of Mississippi and have access to the education that you have. How do we get to a place where every kid doesn't have to cross a line, they don't have to meet a legislator in order to get a high-quality education, but it's happening in every single community in our state? How do we get to that place? And I also want you to share with these guys, like, how can they get involved in that movement to make it happen? And for all of us.
Well, first of all, you use programs to get kids involved. Especially in this community, some of the best ways to do it, so things like Boys and Girls Club, after-school programs, tutoring programs. Like Ole Miss has many students that go to Oxford High, go to Lafayette, go to the local area schools and tutor these kids that are struggling. You send people that truly care to help these kids care about themselves and make the most of their own opportunities, even if they don't have a way to leave that school. But even as you said, they're not going to be able to, most of them won't be able to find senators, things like that will care. But there's always going to be people that will care and help them. You just have to connect the two dots, more or less. And school choice is a way to do that for some of these kids, in the sense that they can find a charter school or a private school. We give these students the means to do so, and so that they are able to go into an environment that's much more conducive to improving their education.
So this is one of the areas where we have a different path. So I agree with the basic premise that, of course, we need to have people that inspire and all that. And one of the great programs we have here is Leapfrog, where y'all can volunteer and go. And they serve students that are underprivileged. They don't have that home nurturing environment. But in order to break that cycle, it's very difficult to legislate morality. It's very difficult for someone, a parent who has dropped out of high school and had a child when they were 14 or 15, to teach them to be responsible and caring and innovative and inspirational to their children when they didn't have that. And we do that by community involvement. Again, you can't legislate it, you can't mandate it, but what you can do is participate in things like Leapfrog. Now, from a school choice standpoint, I agree with the premise that, everyone ought to have an opportunity to have that best school possible. My concern with that is, why not make the school they're in the best possible? And we do that by funding it properly. Because what concerns me is if the bright ones like Eric here leave that school and go to a great school, we've taken away some of the best minds that are in that school. And in my sister, I certainly didn't strive to be the best I could be in high school. If anything, I was a challenge. My parents wanted to put me up for adoption at 16. But my sisters constantly struggled to try to be better than each other and to beat that girl that became the valedictorian because they wanted to be better than each other. So you have to have a goal. You have to have, and a goal is a dream that's within reach. And what is within reach with the majority of people? It's to go to the school, the free public school, and have the best education they can have there, because if we take away the best, then it leaves no inspiration to do better.
As a former teacher, when I look across this room and look at all of you guys, I think of one of the great benefits of having you all here that can address one of the issues that we have in our state with making sure that all kids have a good school in their community. And one of the things that you all can consider, not necessarily for forever, but is teaching, because we have critical teacher shortages across the state. we don't have critical teacher shortages here in Oxford because it's a community where people want to live and there's a lot to do and there are restaurants. But when you start talking about Clarksdale and you start talking about Yazoo County and you start talking about Jackson Public Schools, Jackson Public Schools started the school year one year with 280 teacher vacancies. That means when kids like you guys walked in the classroom, they had a substitute instead of a teacher. And if the adults across the state and young people like you who are engaged would start to really push the idea that there are no other people's children. Those kids in JPS are all of our kids. Those kids in Clarksdale are all of our kids. And so it's incumbent upon us to really see their value and see that they matter, that the education that they get matters, whether or not they make it to college or not matters. And so I think that what we have in our state, that's one of the biggest barriers, you know, whether we talk about school choice, private school, public school, charter schools, we have adults across the state who really don't care. They don't care because it's not their kid. And so what we have to start doing is calling people to the carpet and saying, hey, these students are all of our students. One of the things that I like to say is that, you know, I'm going to be old soon. When I go into a nursing home, I don't get to pick what school district the nurses come from. So if they came from a low-performing school district or a high-performing school district, I want to be an old person in a nursing home that gets the best care possible. And if we don't educate all of our students at an equitable level, then some of our nurses might be able to do math, and some of them might not. And so, you know, that's just one example of how if we don't prepare all of our young people across the state to have the opportunity to go to college or to pursue a career that can really help them move out of poverty, then everybody pays the price, because then we don't have teachers, we don't have police officers, we don't have nurses, we don't have doctors. And so I think that the first thing that we have to do as adults, and you all as young leaders have to do, is to get involved and show that this is an issue that matters to everybody, whether it's your own personal kids or not.
So I think we'll shift the conversation again. This is something that Representative Hughes and I are talking about as we walked up. Raise your hand if you've ever used a public library in your community. Raise your hand if you've used a public library. Put your hands down, please. Raise your hand if you've used a public library in the last year. All right, you put your hands down. Yesterday we had an article come out where across the state we're losing funds for public libraries. In all of our communities, we could see public libraries close. And so I want to ask this panel to talk about what impact that's going to have on communities. Representative Hughes and I were talking at length about libraries are no longer just a place where you go check out books, but it has become the place where we go print things if we can't afford a printer in our home, or we go do research when our computer is even down at home, even if we can afford one. And so I just wanted this panel to talk about what impact that's going to have on education, what impact that's going to have on our local communities when we're starting to lose public libraries.
One of the things I think that a lot of us take for granted because we have internet in our homes is that the public libraries serve as a great place for folks who need access to the internet to be able to do so for a variety of reasons. One of the things that people can do at the library is apply for jobs, because very rarely now will you be able to walk into a business and apply for a job on paper. They will direct you to their website and ask you to go apply online. And if you don't have a computer at home and you don't have internet at home, that's off limits to you. And one of the things that I know is that when you apply for college, you have to fill out that essay. You have to write that essay. That's online. When you apply for financial aid, that's online. If you don't have a computer in your home, you no longer have the opportunity to do that unless you have somebody at school that's willing to help you do so online. And so when we talk about equity and we talk about access, sometimes it's a little bit far-reaching to think about the kids who live in poverty and who don't have a computer at their house or who don't have internet connection in their home, or they may have to find a neighbor or somebody like that. I think libraries serve a vital purpose in equalizing access to things that are important to the community in a variety of ways. And so I think just much like we fight for public schools, I think that we have to continue to fight for and be aware of the importance of our public libraries across the state.
I certainly agree with Crystal on that. It's not just an access. To me, the internet through our local libraries is the interstate that gets us to the future. Most of us in here are privileged and have internet at home. But just here in Oxford, we don't even have it. And it's only when I was out knocking on doors, running as an alderman, that I realized that there was a whole sub-parallel group of citizens that lived here, that live in poverty, right around our little magic area here, that live in government housing, and they had no internet. My law partner and I, though it's now known that we do it, but we did it anonymously, is we went ahead and set up towers around town to provide free internet for everybody to be able to use, because we recognize exactly what Ms. McCormack said, that failure to have access to that interferes with the ability to go to high school, college, get jobs, tax returns, open a business, etc. You know, the irony is that while I'm a Democrat, I call myself purple, because I'm a little red and a little blue on everything. I can't be put in a box. And one of the things that's clear, I can't be put in a box. As a fiscal conservative, one of the things that gets me from a math standpoint, and this deals directly with libraries and cutting funds to them, or underfunding public education in whatever capacity it is, statistically we know, and it's not even disputed, that if you're not reading on reading level by 3rd grade, there's a 90% chance that you will not graduate from high school in Mississippi. Now let's look at it a different way. If you don't graduate from high school in Mississippi, you're a dropout. There is a 90% chance by age 30 you're going to be on government welfare or incarcerated. Now it is far cheaper and more responsible as citizens to educate a child for 13 years than to support an adult for 40 years. So if we're not funding our public schools and we're not funding our libraries, but we are funding, and in fact the only place that got a budget raise this year was the private prison contract. I think our priorities are mixed up. You have a right and an opportunity to make that difference. Our libraries are the community centers. They are the future for all of those who don't have the car or the opportunity to come here. That gives them access to the future that makes better for all of us.
I think this is definitely one issue that we can all agree on. And I think with libraries, one of the often forgotten things is that these are centers of the community, especially for communities that aren't like Oxford, that don't have much else to do for these children. I'm sure you, like I remember growing up, libraries had the summer reading programs, little summer programs they put on for kids, where every week you got to go to the library, you do these little fun activities, have people come do games, things like that, that truly were the highlights of the summer community, where there wasn't anything else to do that didn't involve you getting in trouble. And so libraries are much more than just books, although just the book side of it as alone, a lot of these kids in these communities don't have the money to go out and just buy a ton of books to read for fun, when their families are trying to scrape up enough money just to put food on the table. Libraries offer a way for these kids to go check out books, whatever they want to do. Their books are still the avenue to fulfill your dreams, or whatever they may be. And as they grow up, but like Cortez was saying earlier, outside, business people that are starting a business that don't have the funds to buy access to all these online databases, things like that, can go to libraries, access these resources, use these resources to help themselves build businesses and improve their own lives. Libraries can truly help every member of society from birth to death fulfill whatever purposes they do. And without funding these libraries, and if we let these libraries close, we lose an invaluable resource in the state that already needs every little resource we can get.
So I do have two other questions, but at this time we're going to take some questions from you guys. We want to hear from you all. If you have questions, just stand up as we normally do and ask those questions. You can ask any of us. I see you they're jumping up everywhere. Okay, all right, there you go. Way to go for questions. Stay standing and we'll get to you. We'll take all the guys that are standing, we'll try to take your questions. Let's start here.
My name is Noah Martin, and I'm from Western Mississippi. I wanted to ask Mr. Hughes on his opinion on 42 and 42A.
Well, I didn't do a dissertation, but I'm prepared to give an oral dissertation on it. I'm going to answer it. It's going to sound like a politician answer, but it's going to come from the standpoint of a constitutional attorney. And that is, I'm really, as a military veteran, a constitutional attorney and a Federalist, someone who's actually read the Federalist Papers by Hamilton, I absolutely, passionately respect and defend the right of the people to be the voice of the people. And that is, we have in place a mechanism in our state, under our Constitution, that says if the people want to change a law or create a law, that they have the right to do that. And there's a procedure to go through. So whether I agreed or disagreed with it, which I agreed with 42, and I'll talk about that in a minute, I supported the people's right to try to effectuate change in their state. Does that mean? It offended me at my very core as a constitutionalist when our elected leaders passed something with the purpose of interfering with the people's right to have debate. And for that reason, it's you. For that reason, I was for 42, and I will sign just about any petition that gives people the right to try to have something discussed and debated. Now, on 42 was the issue of the Mississippi Adequate Education Program. Adequate is the term there. And that was that we want all schools to be at least adequate. And I hope that my daughter never grows up and says, gosh, I hope if I work real hard one day I can be adequate. You know, we want better for our schools. All of us want that. So what it was saying is we have a law that the legislature passed, the Mississippi Adequate Education Program, that says all schools will have equal funding. So that we don't have a difference between a school in Jonestown or Itta Bena. We're all going to have the same access to funding. Well, the legislature has only done that one time in 20 years. So schools are not even being funded adequately. I supported 42 because I was going to say, if you won't follow your law, then let's make it a constitutional mandate that y'all have to fund the schools. That was my position. It remains my position. And I will passionately defend that the greatest investment we can make in the future is to make education the absolute top priority and everything else needs to go.
I think that that's a great question, and thank you for that question. I think that one thing that everybody in this room can do as a student, as a rising senior, is really get engaged with the process that's happening in your school. You can go to school board meetings. Every school board meeting, I believe, in the state, constitutional expert has public comment, where you guys can share your perspective about what is happening. limited to 5 minutes, but you can make a 5-minute comment at school board meetings to share your perspective. Another thing that you can do is when you know that school board members' seats are about to come up for re-election, you can encourage people who do care about the school and who do care about all the students to run. And then all of you guys can become involved in knocking on doors and advocating for that person, asking other people to vote for that person, for helping to raise money for that person, because you're right. If people who sit at the table at the school boards don't actually care about the school and the students, then we are doomed. And so, but if everybody in this room would come to the school board meetings and give a level of scrutiny to what is happening, ask questions, try to figure out, well, what does that mean? And if you don't understand what something means, stand up and ask folks to explain. But we have to hold our leaders accountable, or they just do whatever they want to do. And I think that it's incumbent upon all of us to like really get engaged very deeply, make yourself well known, and be one of those people that folks kind of straighten up and sit up a little bit when they see you coming, because they know that you're going to ask tough questions and you're going to hold them accountable to doing what's right by you and your fellow students.
My name is William Yates. I'm from Columbus, Mississippi. And ma'am, you said you grew up in Chicago, and I was just wondering how your experience going through school in Chicago, how that compared to what you saw teaching in Jonestown.
I think that there are a lot of similarities, because one of the things that you guys probably already know is that a lot of families from Mississippi moved to Chicago. And when they moved to Chicago for better opportunities, sometimes they found them and sometimes they didn't. So like Chicago, there are a lot of families that are trapped in a cycle of generational poverty, similar to what exists in Jonestown and Clarksdale and, around the North Delta. So I feel like there were a lot of similarities. I'm a first-generation college student. I was the second person in my family to go to college and to graduate from college. And so there's a lot of similarities to my family and families that I knew in Chicago to families in Jonestown who were also like trying to work really hard to get an education and get access to a quality one.
Right here.
This is for Mr. Hughes. Why do you think that all public schools should have the same funding when a school like Oak Grove or Madison Central has a lot more tax dollars coming in than a school like Madisonville or Clarksville?
Well, that's a great question, and I think it's all pupils should have the same funding as opposed to all schools, because clearly the variable in there is the number of students. I'll give you just a basic legal lesson in history on how that came to be. And for many years, and Texas was the poster child of this, schools were funded by the local taxes, by the local property taxes. And so you had in San Antonio, the case that ultimately went up to the Supreme Court in the 70s, you had one school district getting about $2,200 per student because they were very poor houses and you couldn't tax the property more, while across the same city they had $17,000 going per student in that one. That led to disparate education and generational poverty and a cycle of poverty. So what each state did, Mississippi, of course, was the very last one, as always, with MAEP. They said, we're going to send tax dollars to the state. The state's going to come up with a formula to ensure that all children in every school have the same access to education. And of course, we decided that would be average, or a C. And so Madison Central does have a higher tax base. Oxford has an amazing tax base. So in the last 6 years, Oxford has been underfunded, according to the average formula, by right at $12 million. We've not had nearly the suffering in our school district that others have, because we've got such a wealthy tax base. We merely raised the property taxes. I say fortunate too, but we did have that fortune, and we kept funding the same as far as what we're getting. Itta-Bena, Issaquah, Yazoo, the coast, they don't have the opportunity to raise taxes. So when they're underfunded at a public school, they don't get to raise taxes. They have to cut services, they have to cut teachers. That's what happens in Jackson. So it's not about the school getting the same amount of money, it's that the students having an equal access to a learning opportunity. Does that answer it?
And if I could chime in and kind of share what that looks like on the ground, I've taught in 2 different public schools in low-income communities. I've never taught in a school with a full-time nurse. Despite having kids with heart conditions, diabetes, seizure disorders, we don't have I've never taught in a school with a full-time nurse. Which we have one in every school in Oxford, I believe. I've never taught in a school with a full-time counselor whose job is dedicated to actually providing counseling services. They have to like do paperwork and stuff like that. So the funding, you know, it seems like kind of nuanced, but when it comes to what students get for that funding, it makes a big difference.
The gentleman in the back, we'll take 2 more questions. So the gentleman in the back.
Reagan Ivy from Macomb, Mississippi. I know that we touched on how community libraries are such a, especially in my city, we have 3 4A schools, and that's where a bunch of our younger generation goes to just to get different materials. But at a public school level, how would you help with libraries who don't have enough information and are underfunded for the libraries themselves that don't have like the books that they need, because not everything can be found on the internet? How would the funding that you would be putting in education go towards a library in the school?
I'll jump on that one. We don't know. I mean, that's the reality. This is what happens when you have a budget that has had $350 million in tax cuts in the last 5 years. We've just passed one with another $415 million in tax cuts. We just had a staff error of $56.8 million, and we had a $108 million shortfall. So the bottom line is you have a general fund that you use to pay bills, and then you have a budget that says where those go. Well, we don't have enough money in our general fund to pay for basic things like mental health, healthcare, drug addict, treatment, public schools, now libraries, all of these things that are being cut, and we're still cutting revenue. So my position has been, I think a very vocal one, that you don't cut your revenue when you can't pay your bills. Because the reality is, to your answer, what can we do in those school districts that don't have enough money to even put the basics in their library is, we don't. There's nothing to do because there is no money.
What's your question? Okay, right here, then we'll take one from this side. So we'll take this one and then one over here. Go ahead.
My name is Trace Bush, and this is whoever wants to answer. I was wondering if you think that with all the standardized testing that are in our public schools now, if you feel like we're more teaching how to test rather than actual things to learn.
I'll defer to you.
I would say absolutely, and a lot of these, that's been a lot of the complaints in many public schools, is that because of the requirements of standardized testing, and because of the consequences of school districts who fail to meet the requirements set by the state, and the goals on the standardized testing, they face losing funding, they face state ultimately taking over anything, punishments like that. The high-stakes testing has been responsible for causing teaching to the test, and many of those standardized tests have no impact on how ready these kids are for college. They aren't about national norm reference tests, things like that. They're just purely methods that the state uses to set an arbitrary goal for schools, more or less.
Yeah, and let me address that one as well. As someone who is a school leader, I think a lot of it has to do with what type of vision the school leader sets in that building. So a principal can come in and say, no, we're going to teach the standards, and the assessment will come later. We won't teach you an assessment, but we'll make sure that kids have a set of experiences that do in fact lead to them being successful. But at the end of the day, we're concerned about, are they working with challenging material? Are they having experiences that expose them to things across the world where they have a very diversified opportunity to learn, and that shifts their mindset and allows them to be put in other places? And finally, are we developing them socially and emotionally? So I think when you talk about standardized testing, yes, we've created a high-stakes culture across America that says, yes, you gotta be successful. But at the end of the day, I think there are still leaders out there who say, testing does not drive the direction and does not drive my mission and vision. My mission and vision is driven by what kinds of experiences kids need to have. And so as a student, you drive your principal, you drive your school board to say, look, we don't want to sit in a room and do test prep every day. We want to understand why we're taking the derivative of this calculus problem. I need to understand why it's important for my subject and verbs to agree. Why is that so? I'm not just doing it because I got to take a test and I got to be able to identify these things on an assessment, but how does this get home for me? So, yes, that culture is there, but I think there are also leaders out there who are saying, no, that's not the culture we're going to create in our building. We're going to be successful and do something different.
All right, my answer is actually going to incorporate about 3 of these questions. So I've got a daughter that's in 8th grade or just finished 8th grade, and so I've got direct knowledge of what they're doing there. And in this year, we had 9 days of standardized testing for her, 14 days of prep. So we're talking about 22 days of classroom instructional time that could have been used to teach her why a subject and a verb agree, or to do whatever it is from an instructional standpoint, as opposed to a preparing for or testing. So what we have in Mississippi is, regardless of who, what, why, we are underfunding our schools. Yet we've just entered into last year a $122 million contract with a standardized testing company to administer these high-stakes tests, that the results of which, if you don't meet them, you've been underfunded and you can't properly train or pay your teachers, and you don't meet them, you even get less funding. So you're punishing the weakest of the weak without regard to whether it's a choice, a charter, or a public school. So we have far too much emphasis on standardized testing and not enough emphasis on the quality of time and education of that. What I'd love to see is an abandonment of $122 million standardized testing and go with benchmark testing at the beginning of each year. And that is that you test that student and see where he is, and at the end of the year you test him and see where he has gone. That would be a goal, and that would allow actually getting recess time or break time back in classrooms. And I do see a gentleman over here shaking his head pretty hard no. Is there something I said that you disagree with? Oh, okay. Well, and so that's my point. Yes, we have far too much time, and what that is a special interest wagging the tail of the tail is wagging the dog. There's no other industry, no other profession that we spend all of our time as a student, as a teacher, going and getting certified and getting a master's degree and becoming a professional, such as a teacher, and then we tell them how to do their job every day, what, when, why, and how. We need to allow teachers to teach and get out of the way.
Do I believe that Common Core is the what?
Success. No.
So I'll explain this.
Wake up, they wake up.
Now you all get up. About a year ago, I wrote a column in the Clarion Ledger talking about Common Core. And what I think has happened with Common Core is there are some myths out there about what Common Core is really about. And I think what you all oftentimes as students, what happens is you all mix Common Core and the state assessment up. So you get those things confused. The Common Core are really just a set of standards that teachers should be using to teach you. And it does not give them a direct path. It just says by the end of the year, the student should be able to do this. Now, I think you asked me a lot. I can't answer the question that you asked me because we don't have enough data to determine that Common Core has been successful. In Mississippi, we've used a different state assessment for 2 consecutive years in a row, so I can't tell you how our students are really performing on those set of standards. But what I can tell you is that when I look at the English language arts standards, as a former English teacher, those are the kinds of experiences that students need to have in order to be successful in college. Oftentimes, you graduate high school not understanding how to analyze a text and think about what was the writer thinking about in this text when he was writing this, and so that translated into your job. We have misinterpretations of documents because people don't have analytical and reasoning skills. And so when you talk about speaking and listening skills, so many of our students walk out of school not able to have an articulate conversation or to articulate their point of view grounded in an argument, and that's what the ELA standards drive to. Now, when you talk about mathematics, Mr. Moss does have challenges with those standards. I think those standards do too much too soon. I think we need to look at how we feed kids those standards. So I do have challenges with the Common Core math standards, but we can't say if they've been successful or not because we don't have a strong set of data that drive towards that. But what I can say is that the standards themselves, the ELA side are setting our students up to be successful when people do right about them and don't try to turn them into what we used to do and say you got to be able to do these 4 or 5 things in order to be successful. And so I want to encourage you all as students, be careful when folks say Common Core, because there's a lot of misinformation out there about Common Core. When they put those math problems on Facebook, that's not necessarily a reflection of Common Core. That's an item that a test company designed to try to meet the Common Core standards. So be very careful when you're critical of Common Core because you may be talking about an assessment rather than the standards. I hope I answered your question.
And I would add to that and say, I think it's really, as far as Mississippi is concerned, we're 49th, sometimes 50th, when we rank the states in terms of academic outcomes. I do think that it is really important to make sure that third graders in Mississippi are getting the same education access and they're getting access to the same information as third graders in Massachusetts. One of the things that was different for me when I came here from Chicago is that the things that my 4th graders were learning in 4th grade math and 4th grade reading were things that 2nd graders were learning in Chicago. And it's not fair that they're going to be competing for the same jobs when they graduate from high school or graduate from college, but they haven't had access to the same information and had the same amount of time to process it. So I do think that it is important that we raise the bar for all of our students across the country and make sure that Mississippi's kids aren't getting less than other kids because our standards are more watered down than standards in other states.
And I want to say one of the things that we have to be careful about in this state, and I'm very blunt about it. When you rank at the bottom, don't be critical of what other folks are doing when they're moving up the ladder. We rank 49 in public education. If we could write standards that would lead to us being number 2, I promise you we would be number 2 already. So we've not developed a set of standards to bring us to the top. So why be critical of something that's bringing other folks to the top? Until we can move the needle in our state, we got to get on the same playing field as other kids. And it's not fair that a kid in Texas or a kid in Massachusetts has access to a quality education and is learning at a more rigorous level than kids in Mississippi. I have a friend who left Ole Miss and went to Harvard. When she talked about the kinds of experiences that the students at Harvard had in high school, she was far behind. She spent way more hours in her room studying, trying to catch up with where they are. We don't have time to play catch up. We're already behind. So let's be careful about being critical of something that will move us forward. So I'll give these folks on the panel an opportunity to jump on the soapbox, run wild, and say whatever they like on the way out. And thank you all for your questions. And I'll give them these last few minutes to speak, and then we'll transition to our next event.
Well, it's clear that you're passionate about it. I want to carry on that question as well, and I want to echo what Mr. Moss said. So when I was studying international law at Cambridge University in England, I found the exact same thing. Things that I was just beginning to experience as a fellow, these other students at Cambridge had dealt with in high school. It is true. Now, the best way to put this in a way that you can understand it, what Common Core is a set of standards. It's a set of standards that says where you must be. It's easier to compare this to a high school or a college football coach. We're not going to tell you what plays to run, but we're going to say if you don't win at least 7 of your 12 games, you won't be back next year. And so what Common Core is, it said here are standards in ELA and mathematics, etc. Now this goes back to school funding once again. we weren't able, as many of these school districts didn't have the ability to properly train or send away for training their students to understand teaching methods that would help get the people to these higher standards. And regardless of whether you call them Common Core, Common Door, or anything else, we need higher standards when we are 49th and 50th. So what some of these poor students and poor school districts did, they took these testing companies' books that said, here's one way to teach it, and they just tried to read it and show that's how you do it. So it was an implementation error as a result of poor funding that led to that. And so kids were making worse grades because they weren't being properly taught, and the parents are mad as hell because their little Johnny's not an A student anymore. So that's what drove the hatred. We need higher standards, we need properly funded schools, and we need better paid teachers. That's the path out of poverty.
There's two things kind of piggybacking like that. With Common Core, one of the biggest problems we've seen, as with any issue that gets involved in politics, there's a massive amount of misinformation out there. People who get offended and just assume it's federal overreach. They're telling us how we have to teach our kids. With standards, the point of standards is to give teachers the freedom and flexibility to develop their own curriculum to reach those standards, and to make sure that these kids are developing the skills necessary to function in life, not just retaining enough information to pass the state test that year and then forget it all the next year. And then secondly, one of the biggest things that Mississippi has got to improve on is accountability of schools and ensuring that schools, while underfunded, and we can certainly agree that we do need to add funding to education. But currently, one of the problems that I've seen in Mississippi education, most school districts have no requirement to report funding to the state Mississippi Department of Education. The Mississippi Department of Education will tell you that they hand out block grants to the districts, they hand the funding over, and then the districts don't. They have no idea how the districts spend their money. And right now, the Mississippi Pure Committee that works for the legislature discovered that districts have cut instructional spending, classroom spending, over the last 5 years, $288 million, while administrative spending and just spending that many times found out to be purely wasteful is increased 13%. When you have no accountability on schools, that's not to victimize these schools. The state has refused to help these schools develop that capability. The state has refused to fund the schools that already have no money to teach kids aren't going to have the money to properly ensure that they're spending that money, what money they have, efficiently. So the state has got to do more to ensure accountability, and the state has got to pick up the bag on that and do it and help these school districts do that.
When I look around this room and I see the diversity, racial diversity, where you all come from, different parts of the state, different types of schools, I think that this is a real opportunity for us to put Mississippi on a different path. Education may not be your thing, but education matters to all of us and will impact all of us, whether education is your thing or not. So when I think about all of the different strengths and interests and abilities that you all have, whether it be public speaking, politics, finance, whatever, singing, Broadway, whatever your next path is, I think that one, you have an opportunity to bring your skills and your strengths to Mississippi to help make it better and to help lift it up. And the other thing is that I think that you have an opportunity to bring your voice and your perspective and your experience to advocate for better schools for Mississippi students, whether that be from you talking about your own experience as a student or you getting involved in school boards or whatever the case may be. I would just encourage each and every one of you to get really engaged in what's going on in your state, because what happens to our students matters to everybody, whether they're your kids or my kids or Jay's kids or whatever. So I really appreciate you all's attention today and your wonderful engagement, and I hope to see you at some school board meetings and down at the Capitol, just really raising a ruckus to make sure that Mississippi can be better.
All right, so guys, we want to thank this group.